So I will briefly introduce now Eyal Weizman, who is an artist, architect. I just really made a whole list, not of the books he did and the project he did, but just the function. Hi, Eyal. Don't know whether you can see us. So he's an activist. He's an architect. He's an academic. And many other things, and he does it really in an exemplary way. I think it's not by accident that his work was mentioned several times during this conference. He published a lot of books that I really recommend you reading. I just mentioned two. One is Mengeles Skull with Sternberg, 2012, Hollow Land, 2007. We discussed it a lot. He has worked with a variety of NGOs and did also plenty of exhibitions. The last one that I saw was specifically impressive at the last architecture biennial in Venice. He's also, and this, when I said he's an academic, sounds like, well, he's got a job at a university. He's got a team or a bunch of PhD students that are not just PhD students, but we could do a whole conference about the legacy of his PhD students, of whom Francesco Sebregondi here is just one of them. He's also an architect and a researcher, and I think he's part of the research fellow at the Forensic Architecture program that we discussed during the conference several times since 2011. He's also been the coordinator of this project for a couple of years and the co-editor of its main publication, that is Forensics, the Architecture of Public Truth.
I'm on actually, and I'm also not sure if you guys are hearing me. Back there.
We can hear you.
Can there be any signal to confirm? Okay, we're good.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lionel. Thank you, Francesco, for this introduction. Thank you, Kader, for setting up this incredible place that I feel also almost without yet being there, that it's kind of a home in Paris. And somehow very much right on time. A time when we really need places like this in order to organize and in order to think through the deep shit that we are in already. Sorry, Francesco, are we good? Are we good? Sorry, I don't hear you. You say something, but I don't hear you.
Eyal, just continue.
I think you're muted on this side. Okay, we're good. So I think that seen from the perspective of the United Kingdom, what is remaining of the United Kingdom here, what will remain of the United Kingdom right now, a certain process where simultaneously the split out of Europe seemed to reconstitute itself around the old colonial and imperial geography of the United Kingdom. A certain return to the colonial present, certain return to those networks of domination where at least something that had a promise of cooperation is replaced by another globalization whose horizon is domination. And I think that would make it necessary. Of course, there is equivalence in France, and there's equivalence in the United States to this predicament. And I think it makes all the more important cultural activism as the one that that you undertake over there, and to a certain extent what we were trying to do with forensic architecture also. A certain insistence on the truth, because we know that colonial violence the violence in the colony is always both a violence against people and things and a violence against the very truth that such violence has at all taken place. And we need to confront negation, not so much also in the court system that are other part of the institutions of the oppressors, including, by the way, the many of the human rights tools and forums that we have. But we need to find new forums in order to insist on a truth of what is happening. I don't think that we've been in a situation with such a radical attack, direct attack on truth has taken place. Now, this might be like a very general introduction, but to a certain extent, this is the reason why a group of us, and this is, you might have heard in the introduction, a group of artists and architects and filmmakers and lawyers and investigative journalists, scientists of various disciplines, grouped together in order to create what we refer to as a counter-forensic agency. Why counter-forensics? Because forensics is the way in which we are dominated. Forensics is the way in which the state surveys us and monitors us. And counter-forensics is an attempt to invert that forensic gaze, to start taking the notion of public truth, the claim for public truth, to civil society. So it's citizens monitoring the crimes of state. I think you're seeing the first slide on the monitor, where you see where you understand that for us in forensic art. Okay. We good? We good? Yeah. Forensic architecture, we very much attune to minute details of architectural form. And in fact, what you see here in the first slide, I am mapping one-to-one mapping. Now, Francesco, maybe you can mute the other side because I hear an echo. Of the shrapnel of an explosion, a drone explosion that took place in Waziristan, in a place that was denied by the CIA, a strike that, like all the drone campaign, was denied. We got those architectural details very much through investigating and interrogating video images that came from that site. Next slide, please. And mapping them in great precise detail. Next one, please. So that we could see, now you should see a room. That room is a one-to-one reconstruction that we have undertaken from those video images in order to establish the truth of a kind of campaign that has been and is being denied by the US. By mapping out all those little shrapnels on the wall, we could figure out the contours of the bodies of the people, you see them marked in red, that died in this explosion. But the kind of research that forensic architecture tries to do operates across scales. So next image, please. If you, by analyzing those shrapnel, we can actually identify what is the precise missile, what kind of Hellfire missile was used in this account, and see how the invention of that missile back in 2009 enabled, next slide please, a kind of an urban campaign. And you see here all the drone strikes in South Waziristan where the drone campaign is taking place. So somehow to connect a micro detail of an analysis of a single room allows us to unlock drone warfare as an urban phenomena, as something that is determining the life of many people in those cities of Mir Ali, Miransha, and Datachel. Next. So if you look now at a next, you should see now dots across a map. And these are where our investigation of drone strike took place across that part of the world. You see a dot in Pakistan and Afghanistan. You see one in Syria and Iraq. You see in Gaza. You see one in Libya. You see one in Mali. And you see one in Yemen and Somalia. And in fact, there is a certain re-establishment of colonial geography that is apparent in that. But we also had the opportunity to check the location, and we mapped all those strikes and where they took place. And it was essential for us to figure out to intersect that logic with other. Next slide, please. Now you would see that most of those strikes have taken place along a single meteorological condition, which is the threshold of the desert. I will come back to it at the end of this lecture in order to explain and perhaps ask, what is the relation between desertification, a phenomena that is a result of climate change, of industrially induced climate change, and a certain aerial campaign from above? What does it mean? How climate change and warfare together bring again and reconstitute the colonial geography that in which we live. Next one is a black slide, but the one after that should be a little clip where you see the prison of Saidnaya. This is I'm going to start now with a discussion of Saidnaya because, again, we are going to start thinking about forensic architecture and about truth against various impossibilities. If in the drone strike campaign that I showed, it was impossible to enter, the Pakistani army create roadblocks and drone warfare all across that area that I showed you is happening in extraterritorial zone where it's increasingly impossible or very difficult to enter and monitor those strikes on the ground. And we needed to rely on 3D techniques of reconstructing video. In the case of Saidnaya, the prison in Syria, we had to rely on another resource that was the only one available based on impossibility. So Saidnaya is perhaps Assad's most notorious prison. It is located north of Damascus, and no monitoring groups have been allowed in at least since the 2011 beginning of the Syrian uprising. Next one, you'd see another short clip. The memory of survivors, next one, and now it's the third clip. You'd see it should start with a laptop screen. What we have done, because there is no other way to understand the architecture of it, is that we worked with 5 witnesses that came forward who wanted to inform the world about Saidnaya, and out of their memories started constructing an architectural model. Now, in Saidnaya, they all experience is at the threshold of senses. They could hardly see anything because they were blindfolded or had to press their hands against their eyes, and they could hardly hear anything because they were not allowed to speak in there. So we are existing, or they existed, in a liminal sensorial space that we were trying to reconstruct very slowly and very carefully by taking 5 testimonies of 5 survivors from Saidnaya and building a model. And the model operated in two ways. On the one hand, the model was a product of memory. It was what very carefully we tried to mash together the five reconstruction of various different details in the description of the prison. But the model was also a door into memory. We think that we need to revisit the whole notion of testimony and turn it from a very unmediated experience of kind of a one-to-one discussion and to think about how architecture, modeling, acoustic modeling. We were working with a sound artist called Lawrence Abu Hamdan who created an acoustic profiling, an acoustic model of that space in which we reconstructed the echo and various other sounds in order to reconstruct memory as a kind of cybernetic process, as a distributed process that depends both on sound and image and architectural modeling. Next image, please. Based on that, it's another clip. You should see the prisons circling around. And we've created a navigation system in which you could enter, you could walk through this prison. In fact, the entire process of reconstruction was very much based on computer machine engines that take the prisoners, the former detainees, back into the space and allow them to connect to testimonies and memories that they could not have otherwise accessed. You should see now a clip that has it's called a hatch. It has sound, so let it play with the sound.
نفس الشيء اللي سميناه طاقة، شيء تحت بيسموه شراء. عرضه بقدر.
So basically what happened in this sequence is that our modeler here on the right, this is Hania Jamal, a Palestinian architect, is asking the witness to describe a very simple detail of the door. She's trying to model the door. And the description of the door necessitate or make necessary for the witness to describe the location of the hatch. And then she asks him about what's the size of the hatch. And he remembers it's as big as his face. Now let's hear the next very, very short clip.
اللي مدرسك. اللي مدرسك. أنا ما فهمت. اللي مدرسك. من وين؟ اللي مدرسك من
هون.
أنا قلت لحالي اكذب، قلت له ما بيطلع. هو فعلا راسي بالطول ما بيطلع. قلت له ما بيطلع، قال بالعرض. بيعرف حاله إنه بالعرض بيطلع راسي. فعملت هيك، ففعليا أنا وقت عملت هيك راسي بالعرض مرق بالعرض يعني وقت صار العرض تبع راسي هو الطول الطبيعي. وبعد ما طلعته بالعرض رجع جلس لي بحيث صار جوزة حلقي على زي هي هذا الزي تبع.
Let me know, Francesco, when it's done. Okay, yeah. So in a sense, you could see how triggering of one of the most horrific moments of his experience started with a very simple architectural model. Sometimes architecture becomes the depository of memory, and you never know. It's a process that is very unpredictable, but architecture could be that doorway or that hatch, as you see here, into a reconstruction of memory, of an image, in fact, when image doesn't exist. Now, the image here is more than simple representation, because the imaging process is exactly what allows recollection. So we need to revisit these kind of binaries of the kind of purity of memory. Memory is divorced from an image, you know, the kind of the discussion perhaps between Godard and Lanzmann on the missing real, memory versus image, and understand image as and a computer created image as a process. Image for us in forensic architecture is always a door somewhere else. It's never, the meaning is never crushed on the surface of the image itself. The next clip now, please. play also with sound?
بالعكس أنا هيك بتوقع إنه
كيف تتوقع؟
وقت الأكلنا عاقبونا يعني آخر شيء إنه أكلت كف هيك بس لمحت إنه منطقة واسعة دائرية. بس الدرج اللي طلعناه يعني كتير أخذوك هيك وجابوك هيك، عرفت كيف؟
ايوه
من كتر الضرب ما تعرف تميز أنت. أنا بتوقع دائري إنه هيك المحتى بتذكر لا لأنه ضربني كف بس فتحت عيني يعني ما بإيدي.
اوكي هي دائريه هيك والزنات حواليها يعني.
انا بتخيل انه دائره بس انا المحتى دائره صاله دائريه.
So I think what is very unique about this moment, and we could really spend an entire hour only speaking about that moment of recollection, is that we know, and the other witnesses could tell us, that the memory that is described in that scene describe a space that doesn't exist. The corridor is in fact straight. So you need to ask yourself, where did the circular corridor come from? And we faced an enormous amount of these memory glitches or memory distortions. And sometimes when you have various witnesses, you can verify. You can simply throw it out and correct and find the right historical or architectural description. But that would lose a lot, because in the errors, sometimes the truth of the event lies. Because the error contains more information than a faithful description. Faithful description simply contains information about how the space looked like. An error contained both that and the condition, perhaps the trauma, or the sense of being there in a particular place and time. But I want to show you various other techniques and technologies that we're using. And now I will very briefly, we would effectively see a film very soon. But first of all, maybe we go to a grid of images on Rafa and press play on this. And what I want to say about this is when forensic architecture was asked to research the 2014 Israeli attack, horrible attack and bombing on Gaza, one in which Francesco, who was introduced, was absolutely central in this investigation, and has undertaken an enormous amount of research and still does on this, and I hope that later he can answer some questions about it. We were not allowed to go in, nor Amnesty, with which we collaborated, was allowed to go in, to enter. And what we needed to do is to undertake that research purely through image analysis. So we hoovered in from the internet 7,000 clips and images, pretty much belonging to one day during that conflict. But the problem is when you see images like that, they don't have metadata. And when you look at a grid of images like this, you see enormous amount of destruction. You see tragedies going everywhere, but you cannot build a narrative. It doesn't help you understand what has taken place. So you're almost desperately, next slide please, trying to build a narrative and locate every image in space-time. So you have an image like this, you see a bomb cloud in the background, but you don't know where and when this image was taken. Architecture can take you only thus far. You can try to find those buildings on satellite images. Sometimes you're successful, most often not. You can try to establish the time by the shadows. Sometimes you're successful, most often you're not. Until we realize at some point that the most important time and space indicators on the images are not in the ground part of the image, but rather in the sky sky part of the image. We needed to look not at the architecture of the city, but at the architecture of clouds in the air. Next image, please. You would see that in art history, and you have had many attempts, and in fact, art history was the most important resource in doing that, because here in the sketches by John Ruskin, a British art historian, the various attempt to understand the geography of the sky, the constantly morphing geography of the sky. Of course, the clouds that we were looking at were not meteorology. Next, they were the result of bombs. And inside a cloud like that, inside this candy floss looking cloud, there's everything that the building was. What is the cloud made of? It's made of architecture in gas form. The architecture, the cloud is concrete, and it's plaster, and it's wood, and it's plastic, and it's glass, and it's utensils, and it's parts of bodies, and it's part of the clothes of the people that were in the house. Everything is mixed together and moving up the air, creating an architecture that is 10 minutes long, continuously morphing. Next, please. So we've created our own version of a cloud atlas. And now I will show you about an 8-minute long video after that to show you with sound, with a narration. I think it would be easier if it's narrated by the person that has narrated that in forensic architecture. Maybe you can see that now, and I'll refer to it when it's done. Just let me know.
This is the bombing of the Tunnel neighbourhood, the deadliest attack of the 1st of August 2014. We have collected hundreds of images and videos from Rafah by witnesses who experienced the events firsthand. 3 videos capture what we suspect to be the same bombing incident. We study the constantly shifting morphology of the smoke plumes and compare them. The form of the plume is unique at any given moment. Comparing the exact shape of the plume allows us to find the overlapping still frames and to synchronize the clips. We locate the cameras on the satellite photograph. We determine the line along which the camera is located by connecting identifiable structures in the image, a water tower and a football stadium. The camera is somewhere along this line. We locate and measure other structures within the image to determine the camera's perspective and the edges of the photograph's frame. We locate the other 2 cameras in a similar fashion. We measure the size of the smoke plume within each frame and intersect the 3 perspectives. The site of the strike is at the intersection of the 3 axes. A satellite image from after the strike confirms this location. This satellite photograph, taken at exactly 11:39 a.m. on the 1st of August, offers a rare insight into the battle as it developed. The destruction of the Tanur neighbourhood is already visible on the satellite image. To determine the precise time of the strike, we use shadow analysis. In this clip, the videographer, just before shutting off the camera, zooms out to reveal the shadow lines cast on the flat roof from 2 columns. We use these columns as sundials. We match the camera's orientation and lens distortion with a digital model. We simulate the sun's movement after calibrating it to the morning of the 1st of August 2014 in Rafah. The shadows overlap at 10:53 a.m.
Are we done?
We verify
is the film
by finding correlating events within our image complex. We look at the satellite image from the 1st of August and notice a plume of smoke from a recent explosion. We look through the image archive to find a photograph that captured this explosion. Smoke clouds are metadata. They hold information regarding both space and time. We find a sequence of photographs of the same location and showing a similar smoke plume. The metadata on these photographs is wrong. It shows that the photographs were taken shortly before midnight, which is highly unlikely. Although the metadata is incorrect, the time gaps between the photographs are consistent throughout the sequence. We recreate the rhythm of the image sequence. We measure the size of the plume as it morphs in the photographs to find the closest frame to match the plume in the satellite image. Knowing that the satellite image was taken at 11:39 a.m., we can therefore anchor the ground images accordingly. This set of images was taken on the same camera. This we verify
I suppose it's over, or it's just drawing to an end. Sorry, I just don't see it, man.
According to the previous calculation. We find the Tanoa bomb plume in this sequence. The time matches with our shadow analysis. Using these techniques, we build a timeline of the events of the day. At 10:55, people seeking protection next to the hospital took these photographs, showing the strike on the Tanoa neighborhood. We recognize the shape of the plume. This video of the strike shows two bombs in mid-air, fractions of a second before impact. We find the craters they generated in the satellite image. We measure the size of the craters and the impact area. Since we know the distance between the videographer and the bombs, we can locate a scaled image plane on the 3D model.
Okay.
We can measure this plane and determine the shape and size of the bombs. An online catalogue helps us to determine the bomb to be a US-made Mk-84 packed with 1 ton of explosives. The same bomb plume was recorded from several different perspectives.
Oh, perfect.
We can see civilians fleeing northwards.
Okay, so I guess that one thing that I really wanted to emphasize about this work is not only the architecture of the clouds and the architecture of the sky, that as you see, the clouds become the metadata. The clouds allow us to sync up and to find the location of each of these bombs, and finally to start telling a narrative. All that is just the beginning. It allows us to sync up all those images, but then you bring in the testimonies into them, because also the testimonies of the victims from Gaza that we've finally been able through Amnesty to receive their testimony, have remembered the battle through those smoke clouds. So the smoke cloud collects somehow media and dust and data and testimony and memory. It's a kind of a vertical connection that brings together all those things. And also you can see how architecture really operate here as an optical device, as a way of seeing. And I'm sure that Francesco could discuss this project with you further when it comes up after that. I want to really just dash through a series of images, but first I want to get the feedback whether we have time to start a new investigation, or perhaps we could even close here and take questions. I want to know. Francesco, are we good for another 10 minutes? Okay, so well, I know about five more minutes. Let's see the bulldozer on a truck going, and we're gonna dash through it here with a satellite image by Fazal Sheikh. Where we are is just across the border from Gaza, in the northern Israeli Negev desert, where the battle is waged now between the military, police, and other state authority to uproot the Bedouins from their places, based on the lie that the Bedouins are nomads. Now you would say, but Bedouins are nomads. What's a lie about that? Well, the Bedouins in this area have not been nomads for the past 100 years. Not only have they not been nomad, nomadism is used against them to say, if you're a nomad, you do not have a right to claim land. The land that you migrated upon is too dry, is too arid, and you cannot have cultivated it. Next one, you would see a cemetery, and you would see the way in which the acts of displacement and return are undertaken by all sort of means. You'd see here a small Bedouin village that is built around a cemetery in this beautiful photograph by Fazal Sheikh. The Bedouins are perhaps the only Palestinians that continuously, in practice, day in, day out, return and act the right of return on the ground. You know that the right of return is a very important kind of tenet of Palestinian national struggle. The Bedouins actually do it. They return, and they return to cemeteries mainly, and they return to archaeological sites where that operate as an anchor. But you see around them, these are cultivation of new forests. These are memorial forests that were actually donated by Germany as a kind of a Holocaust memorial forest that is used to displace the Palestinians. Now you see all those tractors in the kind of 104th destruction of that village we have experienced very recently. Bedouin Palestinians have defended that place, rebuilt it 103 times, and 104 times it was deserted. Next, you would see a meteorological map, and you see this very strange line, the 200 millimeter line, which is where a thinning gradient of blue shifts to yellow. And the 200 millimeter line is legally the threshold of the desert, and that's because apparently you cannot cultivate wheat under 200 millimeter rain. But that means that for the state of Israel, as along many of the colonial states before it, and the national states around it in the Arab world, do not give property rights under 200 millimeter rain. They call it the desert, and the desert, there is no private property. Next, you would see that maps, this 1891 map, the finding out of the threshold of the desert was always a colonial priority, because empires did not rule in the desert. They ruled till the last field. Next, you see an aerial image of Libya, Italian colonization of Libya, where in fact the first use of the statement to make the desert bloom appeared in our region. The Italian fascists used it in Mussolini used it in 1922, well before Ben-Gurion adopted it as a Zionist slogan. That means, to make the desert blue means colonization is seen as climate change. Colonization is not simply taking over of land, it is the reconditioning of land, changing climate in them. Next, you would see always along this line the meeting point between Bedouins and settlements in the West Bank. You see a forest now on the dunes. Then now you see a kind of a horseshoe-shaped forest, and you can see that in the next slide it is built over a ruin of a Palestinian Bedouin home, and this is that home in 1945. So now you should see a black and white image with a house with a red square around it. So this is how we return to the relationship between drone strikes, desertification, and climate change. The 200 millimeter line, that line along which all drone strikes now take place, is a colonial line of government. Resistance to colonial government were always undertaken from just outside, from just under the 200 millimeter line, the desert line. And therefore, there is a kind of a history of resistance to colonialism from those areas, and also colonial regimes, both the Italian, next image, you see an Italian Air Force, a very early Air Force in the period after the First World War, next to an Italian colonial house. The way of governing beyond the desert line was always by Air Force. Not the Europeans were not sending their armies into the desert. They were using their air forces to create what was called aerially enforced colonization. Next, you see a dust cropper poisoning Bedouin fields in order to displace them somehow in continuity with the bombings of the past. Next slide, you would see a kind of a map of an NDVI map of vegetation vigor, and you can start seeing in the next one how the Bedouin here in black dots on this map have been displaced from the greener part, where you see the white dots. These are Israeli Jewish settlements, so that the displacement of Palestinians is not only a loss of land, it is also a loss of the climate. It is also a banishing into the desert, so to say. Here you see a kite image with a day's work of a bulldozer. You can really reconstruct the back and forth movement of a single bulldozer that destroyed that community in an image by Public Lab here. And you could see that the desert is like the surface of the desert is like a photographic surface. It preserves traces like a photographic print is preserving traces on it. Next one, you would see another point of eviction. And next, you would see just few circles, another aerial image by Fazal Sheikh, where those circles are actually the result of a single goat tied to a pole in the center, and the shit of that animal soils the ground in a way that creates those very identifiable stains. And then when they evict and return, you see those that are a year old, you see those that are 2 years old, 3 years old, simply by the level of saturation of the point on the map. We had to, and this is also I'll try to draw it to a close. Let's go through those pages of the book to locate Orientalist literature on a map. You should see a map now where we read those old Orientalist literature and try to find out traces of Bedouin life in them. You should see now Nouri el-Ukbi next to a well, where we start to map out now all the old archaeological sites that remain within there. You should see now, go another 5 forward, and you should see a map from December, not a map, a photograph from December 1917, which is a command charge for the Australian Cavaliers to take over a hilltop in this area. These are documents from the First World War. These are military documents that use photography in a military command. But you see that in order to orient the soldiers, there is something at the foreground of that image. There is a waterhole that somehow we can see that there was presence of people in 1917 in that area. And in the next image, this is a contemporary photograph of the same waterhole that was seen in 1917 and showing continuity. Next picture, you would see an aerial photograph again from the First World War of Bavarian pilots. It is a military photograph, but at the threshold of the images, we need to know how to read them. And somehow, always at the margin of those images, we could see and locate traces of Bedouin lives. I'm just going to go very quickly over the next few images. We're trying to locate on the ground and use kites and balloons, as you can see here. You should see now a kite. That kite in the sky is not simple game. There is cameras attached to it. Next one, you should see another kite. You have, this is a clip. There is a camera attached to it, and the movement of the kite allows a sort of a survey, alternative survey of the terrain. Here you should see in blue a kind of all in 3D the path of the kite in the air. Now in green you see all the perspectives until you can create a very detailed map. Here you see that. We're going to now just go very quickly over those images and how we interpret and how we find also the same kind of circular traces. Now we can return to the image, to the Bavarian black and white image, and now we draw all the way to as far as you can zoom. You have a series of about 10 of those images that you can flick through when you can see traces of farms and settlements and Bedouin tents. It's hardly identifiable. Now you see just a hole in the center of the frame. This is a well, and the idea is really to allow the new kite photography. Now you should see a grid of images. The two columns on the right should be in color, and the column on the left should be in black and white. The kite images are a way to read the old photographic images from the First World War. Here you have now a 3 version, and it allows you to effectively say that the symmetry. Now go to the last slide to identify that what you see on the right-hand side in this last slide on the presentation is effectively the very same symmetry that we see here on the kite image on the left, and that it existed before, well before the establishment of the State of Israel. So who is the squatter now? Thank you. Okay, I suggest that, it would be great. Thank you very much, and thanks for accommodating my absence. I hope something got communicated. And I think, Francesco was involved really very deeply with the last two. As I can hardly hear, I hope that Francesco can undertake some of the questions.
Thanks a lot, Eyal, in case you can hear me. And yes, indeed, we as I said in my introduction, Francesco is a very close collaborator of Eyal, and we should use the opportunity to have maybe a few minutes of Q&A. Yeah, maybe you can choose one of my 3 questions that I have, because it's, really choose one of them, and then maybe there's one in the audience. Right at the beginning, Eyal talked about these timely places somehow. So there's an interesting relationship between time and space. So you discover spatial questions, or you find answers to spatial questions in time, and the other way around. So that's one thing. A very simple question is for our conference here, like, what's the relationship between theory and practice? Like, how do you practice what you're doing, right? You're all doing PhDs, and you, so what's the logistics of working together? I think, and these questions are, of course, not independent. And then, yeah, with this timely thing, there's also this nice phrase that he had: architecture as the depository of memory. So there's this space and time question. And then another question we discussed a lot the last few days is this direct attack on truth. So is this a project to discover truth, or to produce, construct truth, or is that even, can one even distinguish that? So one is the time and space question. One is like really the practice of your theory, or the theoretical basis of your practice. And the third one is, are you constructing truth, or are you detecting it? Choose one.
Right. I'll start with the middle one.
Francesco, est-ce que vous pouvez monter un petit peu le son? Apparemment, c'est un peu bas le son.
Ouais. So I would say that at the heart of the forensic architecture project, there is this sort of schizophrenia, if you want, this attempt to actually be at the same time a forensic agency, an agency that is engaged on the ground and undertaking investigations, working with human rights organizations, with the UN, being in the field and taking part in these productions of reports, but also of truth claims, and at the same time producing a critical reflection on it, and in fact having this activity fueling our conceptual and critical research that we're undertaking also in the framework of academia, because the project is based at Goldsmiths University in London. I didn't get a chance to actually give you a quick intro about the overall project before, but yeah. So I think this is a tension in the project between theory and practice that is simply not resolved. In many cases it produces contradictions, like we can have I was presenting a report on white phosphorus munitions in the UN office in Geneva, trying to be as clear and precise and as possible in terms of the factuality and the objectivity of what I was presenting, as in, for political reasons, trying to remove any doubt about what we were producing in terms of truth claims. And at the same time, the next week we may have a seminar with Latour about the construction of scientific fact and the absence of a true reliable idea of objectivity. And we constantly kind of oscillate between the two. Sometimes these contradictions are not resolved, but I think they work as a sort of engine for the project itself. And that's, I think, the kind of relation between theory and practice that we try to have. I'm a bit lost with the previous questions. I don't know if we even have time, actually, because I know from Lionel that we need to kind of wrap up, but...
Already happy with this. I don't think it's a paradox, actually. It's an interesting shift. You play according to the rules of factuality, but the way you work is actually shifting this definition of truth. But
let me add this very important point about truth and whether it is constructed and detected. The volume that assembles all the work we've been producing since 2011, called Conférences, the subtitle is "The Architecture of Public Truth," and in that sense we recognize that what we understand as public truth is something that needs to be constructed, that needs to be labored, that needs to be negotiated in a variety of forums that we try to intervene into, legal, political, but also cultural forums such as these. So it is not trying to actually go back to science and forensics and this level of objectivity to remove any notion of kind of construction of truth, but understand truth as a political stake that needs to be negotiated, and in that sense we mobilize a variety of disciplinary fields in order to intervene into this production, negotiated and debated construction of public truth.
also relates nicely about some things that we discussed with Julieta, no platforms and so on, but you're stressing this agency. So it's an agency of production of something. Given that we are all a bit exhausted, and you especially, I don't know how many kilometers you made like in the last hour trying to make this possible. So I would like to thank you a lot, and before we applaud you, announce the next or the last event, or well, there's a party afterwards, but there's a performance first at 8 o'clock. 8:15, so in 1 hour. By Cantuta Kios and Alyosha Imhoff in French, and of course Camille de Toledo aussi. Thanks a lot, Francesco. This was truly amazing.